This is lecture 5 from chapter 17, and we are picking up with our next cycle. We're looking at the nitrogen cycle. So our last lecture looked at the carbon cycle and how carbon moved through an ecosystem. So here we're looking for nitrogen, and we're going to start again where nitrogen has its reservoir, the non-living part of the ecosystem. And it's got the same reservoir as carbon dioxide. The reservoir for nitrogen is as a gas in the atmosphere, and it's going to be there. In fact, most of the air that you breathe in is nitrogen. About 80% of the air we breathe in and out every day is nitrogen gas, and organisms can't use nitrogen in its gas form. We need it in one of its other forms. And so if we look, it's going to get pulled out of its reservoir by an organism, but this time, if we follow the line, it's not going to get pulled out by a plant. It's going to get pulled out by nitrogen-fixing bacteria. So nitrogen-fixing bacteria, there's actually a set of them that's going to do this. They're going to pull the gas out of the atmosphere. They live down in the soil. These nitrogen-fixing bacteria are going to turn that gas into nitrogen compounds that we can use, like nitrate, nitrite, ammonia, and so forth. So why do plants and animals need this? Well, as you can see here, nitrogen we need to make amino acids, to make our proteins. So we need this in order to be able to build our body molecules. So we're going to have these bacteria pulling nitrogen out of the atmosphere for us. Then, number 2, we're going to have plants pull out the nitrogen from the soil. So bacteria are going to pull it from the reservoir, and then plants are going to take it up from the soil, the converted nitrogen. Then it's going to get passed through the food chain, so that's number 3. Pass through the food chain. Then we've got right here, from the food chain down to this arrow, that is that death and defecation, D&D. So animals die and defecate, or poop, as you may want to say. So they are going to die, return to the soil, and then eventually we have another type of bacteria over here, different from these guys, and these bacteria are going to take that nitrogen and return it back to the atmosphere. So they're going to take these nitrogen compounds, break them down, and turn them back into nitrogen gas to return it to the atmosphere. So the big difference here for the nitrogen cycle versus the carbon cycle is that we need bacteria to be able to pull it out of the reservoir and then put it back into the reservoir. So that's something we don't see in the carbon cycle. Now, the thing that you don't see here on this picture is how humans alter this cycle. And we do. Because nitrogen is a limiting plant growth item. So it works like a bottleneck. Basically, it limits how much plants can grow in any given area. Those bacteria can only pull so much nitrogen out of the atmosphere at any time. And when we want to grow plants like corn, soybeans, any of our crops, the nitrogen's not going to be enough in the soil. And so what we do is we make fertilizers. We actually learned back around the Second World War how to make nitrogen fertilizers from the atmosphere in a similar way that the bacteria do. We can just do it using chemicals. And so we make nitrogen-based fertilizers, and we can spread them out on the fields and be able to get our plants to grow bigger and faster than they would naturally. So that's how we alter the nitrogen cycle. So the last cycle we're going to look at is the phosphorus cycle. And the phosphorus cycle is a little different on how it works. So again, the first thing to look for is the reservoir. So where is the phosphorus? Well, the phosphorus is in the soil. So the reservoir for phosphorus is actually in the soil. It actually comes from rocks. So that's what we're seeing over here. So we're actually going to start with number 4. I know that sounds weird. So rain actually erodes the phosphorus out of the rocks and into the soil. And then we get the phosphorus in the form of phosphate, as you can see here, hanging out in the soil. That phosphate will then, now we can go to 1, be taken up by our plants. Then that phosphorus will get passed from the plants to the animals through the food chain. And then these guys are going to do just what we saw before. That's right, D&D, death and defecation, where they're going to add that material to the soil. What we've got right here, we've got a set of bacteria. We've got decomposers. So these decomposers are going to break down those dead organisms, that the feces and so forth, and return that phosphorus back to the soil. So that is the phosphate cycle. Different because the reservoir is in the soil. Phosphorus never makes it into the atmosphere. It's going to stay in the soil, start in the soil, cycle through the organisms, and then come back to the soil. So how do humans alter the phosphorus cycle? Well, we alter it in the same way that we do the nitrogen cycle. We also will get phosphorus to put into our fertilizers. We mine the phosphorus. We don't have to make it like we do the nitrogen. We mine the phosphorus out of those rocks, add it to our fertilizers. And what you see in this picture is the result of the increase in those phosphorus and nitrogen fertilizers. So you can see these are the guys coming in, the nitrogen here and the phosphorus here. When we get big amounts of nutrients coming into aquatic systems like a lake, and this is not photoshopped, this is actually what the lake looks like, you get huge blooms of algae and bacteria. These organisms then start to die and consume the oxygen, which then lead to animal die-offs like fish. This process is called eutrophication. And so humans altering the nitrogen and the phosphorus cycle lead to this problem. So this is why we're looking for alternatives to changing these cycles, but unfortunately, phosphorus, just like nitrogen, is a limiting nutrient. And so if you don't have enough of it, your plants aren't going to grow well because you need phosphorus to build a lot of macromolecules like DNA, RNA, ATP. And so the plants do better when they have extra phosphorus. All right, so that is the end of the cycles. And I'm going to stop there and pick up with our next lecture with this, talking about how species interact with each other. So up to this point, we've been talking about ecosystems and how our organisms interact with the environment, their habitat and so forth. Now we're going to look at how different species interact among themselves and with other species.